Welcome wrestling enthusiasts and aficionados to a riveting exploration of the downfall of this once great promotion with our WCW Iceberg. In this video, we'll delve into the tumultuous journey of WCW, once a titan in wrestling, but now remembered for its spectacular rise and dramatic fall. Join us as we uncover the iceberg's layers, from the internal power struggles to the ill-fated business decisions that ultimately led to WCW's demise. Prepare for a deep dive into the downfall of a wrestling empire and discover the untold stories behind one of the most captivating chapters in wrestling history. This is the WCW Iceberg. And we're starting off at the tippity top of the iceberg, Tier 6, with our first entry on Tier 6 being the ending of Goldberg's streak. It's hard to get across just how ridiculously popular Bill Goldberg was during his late 1990s WCW run. The undefeated streak, the jackhammer, and his unbelievable victory over Hollywood Hogan live on Nitro was the only thing that seemed able to turn the Monday Night Wars back in WCW's favor. So what did WCW do? They took the belt off of him in a screwjob finish, of course. In 1998, Eric Bischoff had come to rely on Kevin Nash's advice extensively, and eventually Bischoff wound up making the arrangement official and named Kevin Nash as WCW's head booker. Nash had barely had the job for 10 seconds when he booked himself to beat Goldberg in a world title match, though it involved a cattle prod and some NWO shenanigans including Scott Hall. Kevin Nash ended Goldberg's 173-win streak, and this was one of the worst decisions in WCW history, but it only gets worse from here. And up next we have the finger poke of doom. Just 1 week after Goldberg's streak was ended by Kevin Nash and a cattle prod, WCW put on one of the worst matches in wrestling history. They also decided to end any interest in an intra-NWO rivalry between the NWO Wolfpack and the NWO Hollywood. New WCW head booker and WCW World Heavyweight Champion Kevin Nash booked himself in a match defending his title against Hollywood Hogan. This could have been a huge pay-per-view main event that saw two sides of the same faction alive, and a storyline that could have given the company months and months of storytelling opportunity. Instead, the pair got into the ring and stood face to face. Hogan then simply poked Nash in the chest, causing the 7-foot-tall champion to throw himself to the ground and allow himself to get pinned. This moment was so ridiculous and damaging, and to make matters worse, on the orders of Eric Bischoff, announcer Tony Schiavone revealed that Mankind would be winning the WWE Championship on the taped edition of Monday Night Raw airing simultaneously on the USA Network. The plan was intended to dissuade viewers from changing the channel, but it backfired immensely, with nearly 1 million wrestling fans switching from WCW Monday Nitro to Monday Night Raw to watch the universally loved Mick Foley become a world champion for the first time. And up next we have Vince Russo becoming the WCW World Champion. Vince Russo had once sworn that he would never appear on WCW TV, but by the time that he and Bischoff took over together, Russo had apparently gotten over his camera-shy instincts. Booker T defended the WCW World Heavyweight Championship against Russo in a cage match. When Goldberg, having entered the cage, speared Russo through the wall and out of bounds, the Booker then became champion. It was a sad, strange development, and perhaps the worst part of this is that it didn't even seem like a big deal at the time, because so much damage had been done to the title and the organization, and it was merely more of the same. And up next we have the firing of Stone Cold Steve Austin. Much has been made of WCW's mismanagement of talent and the propensity for getting rid of wrestlers whom WWE made into stars. There's many an example of this, but the most significant example by far is with Steve Austin. Steve Austin first joined WCW in 1991, and despite being less than 2 years into his professional career, he quickly became a rising star. Feuds with talent such as Barry Windham and Ricky Steamboat, a stint with the Dangerous Alliance, and 2 reigns as the WCW television champion cemented his status as a player in the organization. He would later join Brian Pillman as the World Tag Team Champions in the Hollywood Blondes. He then also became the United States Champion. It was clear that Austin was a future world champion, and there was talk of a feud between him and the then title holder Ric Flair. In the spring of 1994 though, Hulk Hogan joined WCW. Before long, the future of Stone Cold was put into doubt as he was relegated to working non-televised dark matches before pay-per-view events. And while rehabbing his triceps injury, Austin was fired from WCW via FedEx package by WCW Vice President Eric Bischoff, who alleged that he simply wasn't marketable. Austin would then hold on to his grudge against Bischoff and Hogan, and after a brief stint in ECW, he headed to WWE, where he would become one of the biggest stars that wrestling has ever seen. And up next we have the kick that ended Bret Hart's career. Bret the Hitman Hart is someone whose career was tragically cut short, but he still has a place in the hearts of fans as one of the greatest professional wrestlers of all time. He was a world champion in WWE, but the events of the Montreal Screwjob led him to joining WCW, where he also became a world champion in that promotion. But in WCW, disaster struck at the latter end of 1999 when he was on the receiving end of a wayward kick from Goldberg that caused his career to come to a close. The botched mule kick delivered by Goldberg gave Bret Hart a severe concussion. Unaware of the severity of the injury, Bret Hart continued to compete in matches in the days that followed. Hart would later be diagnosed with post-concussion syndrome, and he had to relinquish his WCW World title on January 16, 2000. Later that year, Hart retired from professional wrestling altogether, and in the years since, Bret Hart hasn't gotten over how Goldberg ended his career. To this day, whenever Bret gets the chance, he buries Goldberg for ending his career and being an unsafe worker. And up next we have Hogan vs Sting at Starrcade 1997. One of the hottest feuds in pro wrestling history was Sting, during his Crow phase, taking on the NWO. He focused on the figurehead of the NWO, Hollywood Hogan, and for many months, WCW teased a confrontation between the two. The bout finally took place at Starrcade 1997, where Hogan would put the WCW World Heavyweight Championship on the line. Sting and Hogan faced each other in what turned out to be a fairly straightforward wrestling match until something went wrong. Hogan hit Sting with his trademark move and went for the pinfall. According to the WCW referee Nick Patrick, he was supposed to make a lightning fast 3 count. However, when Patrick counted Sting's shoulders to the mat, he went at a normal speed. The result was Hogan cleanly pinning the hero Sting on national live television. The announce team would assert that the count was lightning fast, even though fans could clearly see it was not. Patrick was then replaced by the interim referee Bret Hart, who declared Sting the winner after Hogan tapped out to the Scorpion Deathlock. A year of build-up was ruined, and the mystique of the Stinger was gone in an instant. Bret Hart also looked like a complete tool. It made the good guys look like idiots and just served to put Hogan over even more. It also caused huge damage to WCW's reputation. And up next we have Booker T's botched promo. At WCW's Spring Stampede 1997, Booker T cut a promo hyping his Four Corners match to determine the #1 contender for Hulk Hogan's WCW World Heavyweight Championship. During this promo, Booker T accidentally said, "Hulk Hogan, we coming for you, N-word." Upon realizing what he said, Booker T immediately cringed, and later on he revealed that at the time it was the worst moment in his life and he was super embarrassed. Booker T also said that he thought it was the end of his career, as he thought that Hulk Hogan would lobby to get him fired over the use of that word on live television. But thankfully Hulk Hogan didn't. And up next we have the Shockmaster's shocking debut. At the Clash of Champions, the babyface team of Sting, Davey Boy Smith, and Dustin Rhodes was set to introduce their fourth partner for their upcoming War Games match at Fall Brawl. During Ric Flair's interview segment, Sting gave the Shockmaster a huge introduction and set the stage for the Shockmaster to come bursting through a wall in a majestic manner. Unfortunately for the Shockmaster, David Crockett had reinforced the base of the wall with a 2x4 after rehearsals and didn't tell the Shockmaster. So when he burst through the wall wearing his glitter-covered Stormtrooper helmet, he tripped over the 2x4 and fell flat on his face on national television. The helmet went rolling onto the floor, exposing the man behind the mask, Fred Ottman, and making him look like a total idiot. To make matters worse, the wrestlers could be heard laughing hysterically at him on live television. And up next we have Hulk Hogan vs Jeff Jarrett at WCW's Bash at the Beach 2000. Bash at the Beach 2000 saw Double J Jeff Jarrett defend his WCW championship against Hulk Hogan. For one reason or another, Hulk Hogan and Vince Russo refused to let Jeff Jarrett win, and they were determined to put the world title back on Hogan. All three parties then agreed that Jarrett would literally lay down in the ring and let Hulk Hogan pin him, and that's exactly what they did, much to the shock and anger of the fans. It looked extremely unprofessional, and later in the night, Vince Russo got on the mic and began to quote-unquote shoot on Hogan. He claimed that nobody would see Hulk Hogan again in WCW, while also booking a bout between Jeff Jarrett and Booker T later that night for the now vacant WCW World Championship. Hulk Hogan's short match with Jeff Jarrett was Hogan's last match in WCW. Hulk Hogan, who claimed to be unaware of Vince Russo's promo, later sued WCW for defamation of character for the unplanned promo. And up next we have Sid Vicious snaps his leg. At the WCW pay-per-view Sin, Sid faced off against Scott Steiner, Jeff Jarrett, and Road Warrior Animal in a Four Corners match for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. During this match, he suffered one of the most horrific injuries you'll ever see. Members of WCW management allegedly felt that Sid needed to broaden his arsenal of wrestling moves and suggested that he try an aerial maneuver. Sid felt it was unnecessary for a wrestler of his size and type to do high spots and did not feel comfortable doing them, but he agreed to do high spots regardless. And during the match, Sid suffered a leg fracture following his leap from the second turnbuckle in an attempted big boot on Steiner. This fracture was too graphic for many television stations to re-air, and it's way too graphic to put on this video, but it's definitely one of the most gruesome injuries you'll ever see. This injury marked the end of Sid's career for a spell, with doctors saying he'd never run again. But through years of physical therapy and mental tribulation, Sid recovered and has regained mobility in his leg. And up next we have David Arquette wins the WCW World Championship. On the April 26, 2000 edition of WCW's Thunder, movie star David Arquette teamed with the then WCW champion DDP to take on the duo of Jeff Jarrett and Eric Bischoff. The stipulation of this match was that whoever scored the winning pinfall or submission would walk away as champion. At the end of the match, Arquette hit a huge spear on Eric Bischoff, just seconds before Jarrett clocked DDP with the title belt. Both men pinned their respective opponents, but the referee only counted David Arquette's pinfall, awarding him the WCW World Championship in the process. DDP and David Arquette celebrated together in the ring, despite Diamond Dallas Page having just lost the title to Arquette. The whole situation was to promote the Ready to Rumble movie that starred David Arquette and a number of WCW stars, but this cast a huge black cloud over WCW during a tumultuous time in their history. David Arquette was a Hollywood actor who had no experience in the business and had no place in holding one of the most historic championships in wrestling. And up next we have Kevin Sullivan books his own divorce. Chris Benoit's sad, miserably tragic end often overshadows much of his career. One thing that is often overlooked is how he essentially stole another man's wife in WCW. At the time, Kevin Sullivan was an active wrestler, but his main job was working backstage as one of the head bookers. When Kevin Sullivan was given the task of getting over the insanely talented Chris Benoit, he essentially booked his own divorce. Kevin Sullivan's wife Nancy had been a fixture in WCW for years, acting as a manager/valet known as Woman. Sullivan booked an angle where Chris Benoit would lure away his wife Nancy. Since these were the days of kayfabe, he insisted that Nancy and Benoit travel together, eat together, and try to put out the illusion that they were a legitimate couple. However, love takes strange turns and the storyline became real life. Nancy Sullivan divorced Kevin Sullivan and married Chris Benoit for real. Kevin Sullivan responded by burying Chris Benoit on the card, often having him put over younger talent in squash matches. WCW officials didn't lift a finger to help Benoit, as they thought that he had it coming for breaking up Kevin Sullivan's marriage. On the other hand, most of the locker room blamed Sullivan for putting his wife into that spot in the first place. The horrific events of Chris Benoit's last weekend on planet Earth, where he took the lives of his wife Nancy, his son Daniel, and himself, will haunt him forever. There was clearly some animosity between Chris and Kevin Sullivan though, and a lot of wrestling fans have come up with the conspiracy that Kevin Sullivan was the one who was actually behind these murders. And now we're moving down the iceberg into Tier 5. With our first entry on Tier 5 being Scott Hall's alcoholic gimmick. Scott Hall's problems with alcohol addiction have been well documented. During 1998 and 1999, Hall was arrested numerous times for drunk and disorderly behavior. Hall's wife Dana even publicly appealed to the company for help at one point. So what did WCW decide to do with Scott Hall's alcohol issues? Instead of sending him to rehab, they decided to factor it into a gimmick where Scott Hall turned up to wrestle drunk. He would slip out of the ring during matches to drink a beer. Eric Bischoff even came down to the ring once to talk to him, and Hall replied by vomiting on Eric Bischoff. There was no big payoff to this ridiculous storyline, as Hall was kept off of television for an entire year. There was never any explanation for his absence either. This storyline wasn't just ridiculous, but also insensitive. And up next we have Dustin Rhodes as Seven. For weeks there were vignettes on Nitro hyping up Seven. The vignettes were undoubtedly creepy, but probably not in the right way, with some definitely child sexual abuser vibes going on. It seemed like the character was some sort of supernatural Undertaker-style gimmick that would scare children, but it was creepy in all the wrong ways. And when Seven debuted on Nitro, the lights dimmed, with creepy music blaring through the speakers, and Seven floating down the ramp and levitating into the ring. When lights came back on, Dustin Rhodes immediately proceeded to bury the Seven character, pointing out that the costume that he was wearing was crap. Dustin Rhodes would then go on to incredulously ask if he left the WWE for gimmicks like this. He then said that he joined WCW because he wanted to just be Dustin Rhodes, with no gimmicks, but the powers that be told him that he was boring. He then would bury WCW for firing his father, Dusty Rhodes, and said that he plans to make WCW a miserable hell. That was the last time we saw Seven on our television screens. And up next we have Rick Rude appearing on WCW and WWE on the same night. Rick Rude was a bouncer turned professional wrestler and is remembered for his undeniable charisma. Historically, Rick Rude was also known for a significant moment in wrestling, when he appeared on WWF Raw is War and WCW Monday Nitro on the same night, on November 17, 1997. One may be asking, how is this even all possible? It's because Rick Rude had already taped his segment for Monday Night Raw 6 days earlier, and in the week leading up to when it aired, he jumped ship to WCW. And up next we have the Goldberg vs. William Regal shoot conspiracy. There has been a conspiracy that the widely respected William Regal, then known as Lord Steven Regal, tried to shoot on the green and heavily pushed rising star Goldberg. The two stars met on a February 1998 edition of WCW Nitro during the early days of Goldberg's now iconic undefeated streak. This match lasted a lot longer than the typical Goldberg squash matches of the era and looked incredibly clunky by comparison. Some fans have speculated that Regal attempted to shoot on Goldberg during the match in an attempt to make him look bad, as there was a growing discontent in WCW that Goldberg's push may have been going to his head. To add to this theory, Regal was fired from WCW shortly after this match. And up next we have Hogan vs. Warrior 2. When the Ultimate Warrior debuted on Monday Nitro in the summer of 1998, wrestling fans were buzzing, as one of wrestling's most mysterious and exciting characters was back in the big leagues after 2 years away. And because in 1990, the Ultimate Warrior and Hulk Hogan put on one of the best WWF matches of all time, they were looking forward to Hulk Hogan and Ultimate Warrior's program together in WCW. However, their program was very lackluster. The feud between the two got sillier and sillier as time went on, as the Ultimate Warrior would make frequent and rambling appearances, and one time he once appeared in a mirror taunting Hogan, who was the only one who could see him, and this was just cringe to watch. As things got more stupid, fans cared less and less, but they were set for a rematch at WCW's Halloween Havoc in 1998. This match was the drizzling shits though. Everything about this fight was ridiculous. There was way too much stalling, the wrestling was embarrassingly awful, and the finish was an all-time disaster. Dave Meltzer gave this match his lowest possible rating, -5 stars. Years later, Eric Bischoff even admitted that it was one of the worst matches he's ever seen in wrestling. And up next we have the Collision in Korea. The Collision in Korea event was a unique collaboration between WCW and New Japan Pro Wrestling. It took place in Pyongyang, North Korea, at the Mayday Stadium. At the time, wrestling was gaining popularity globally, and both Eric Bischoff and Antonio Inoki of New Japan Pro Wrestling were eager to expand their company's reach. Many wrestlers from WCW and New Japan Pro Wrestling wrestled at the Collision in Korea, with the main event on night 2 being Ric Flair vs. Antonio Inoki. The event drew a massive crowd, with the attendance figures for each night ranging from 150,000 people all the way to 190,000 people, although the exact number is disputed. It must be noted that the people in the stadium didn't pay to watch the wrestling and it was actually forced attendance. Despite the large turnout, the event faced several challenges, including logistical issues, cultural differences, and political tensions. Wrestlers and staff experienced strict regulations and limited freedoms during their time in North Korea, leading to somewhat of a surreal and tense atmosphere behind the scenes. From a wrestling perspective, the matches themselves were well received, but the event's impact on the wrestling world was overshadowed by the political controversies surrounding it. Critics argue that WCW and New Japan Pro Wrestling were being used as pawns by the North Korean regime for propaganda purposes, while others questioned the ethics of holding an event in a country known for its human rights abuses. And up next we have Sting rescued by Robocop. At WCW's Capital Combat, promoted as Return of the Robocop, Sting, then with his bleached hair as Surfer Sting, was attacked by the Four Horsemen and locked in a cage early on in the show. In a moment that brought a lot of cringe to fans, Robocop came to his aid and rescued Sting from the cage. It was not the actor who played Robocop, but it was the character of Robocop, who was brought in to promote the second movie in the series. He ripped the door off the hinges and rescued Sting from the cage, which embarrassed WCW fans all over the world. Even Sting called it the most embarrassing thing to endure. And up next we have Oklahoma. The Oklahoma storyline was one of the most distasteful in the history of professional wrestling. The character was the brainchild of Vince Russo and Ed Ferreira and was brought to television soon after they jumped ship to WCW from the then WWF. The character was a caricature of WWE legend and fan favorite Jim Ross and tastelessly mocked JR's Bell's palsy. This was a new low, even for Vince Russo. The character was played by Ed Ferreira himself, which was itself sort of a joke since Ferreira wasn't a wrestler. This was a problem because Oklahoma won the WCW Cruiserweight title at one point after defeating future WWE Hall of Famer Medusa. The character was considered distasteful by most fans, and Jim Cornette once almost came to blows with Ed Ferreira for making light of his longtime friend JR. And up next we have Blood misses Kevin Nash twice. In WCW, Blood only fell from upstairs because it was a lazy trope to lean on, and WCW couldn't even get it right. In 2000, Kevin Nash was warring with Russo's New Blood faction. Russo booked Blood to fall on Kevin Nash from above. The fake Blood fell and totally missed Kevin Nash. Nash no-sold this as Russo and his pals looked pissed off on the ramp. Things somehow managed to get worse. For the second angle just 2 weeks later, WCW had Nash brawling on the ramp. Blood was meant to fall on him there too, but it kinda missed again. This was just all-round embarrassing. And up next we have Aludra Blayze throws the WWF title in the trash on WCW TV. In the early 1990s, Aludra Blayze was one of women's wrestling's top stars, and in late 1995, Aludra Blayze was the WWE Women's Champion. But at the time, WWE were facing financial troubles, so she was released from her contract as a cost-cutting measure. But this was clearly a problem because she was the Women's Champion. Immediately after she got cut from the company, WCW's Eric Bischoff called her and convinced her to drop the WWE Women's Championship in the trash in WCW, and so she did just that. Obviously, this was all a work and she got the championship back right after. She had to return it to WWE because it was not her property. And up next we have the Pinata on a pole match. Vince Russo felt that the best possible use for WCW's Cruiserweight division was a racist punchline, and therefore had a bunch of Mexican adults fight over a piñata with a check inside of it. Almost immediately, the piñata fell to the ground, and the luchadors were unsure of what to do, so they just continued to wrestle the match that could only be won by retrieving it. Juventud Guerrera finally opened the piñata and only found candy inside, and then Dr. Death stormed down to the ring to beat everyone up for no reason, found the check and left with it. And up next you have Brian Pillman gets himself out of WCW contract early. Brian Pillman was one of the most fascinating and controversial wrestlers of his generation. In WCW, he would form one of the great underappreciated tag teams of his generation with his friend and future legend Steve Austin as the Hollywood Blondes. At the end of 1995 in WCW, Brian Pillman developed his loose cannon gimmick, cultivating a reputation for unpredictable behavior. During this period of time, Pillman changed his once Hollywood blonde and flying Brian clean athletic gimmick for an edgy, out-of-control image. Brian Pillman frequently blurred fact and fiction with his work shoots, but he managed to turn a work into a shoot as he legitimately began to be a loose cannon. Many people around him were wary of his behavior and tried in vain to keep him in check, but he was off the leash. Brian Pillman even managed to fool Eric Bischoff into giving him a release. Pillman and Bischoff were doing an angle where Bischoff had fired Brian, and Pillman had convinced Bischoff that to really make everyone think it was real, WCW's legal team needed to write a legitimate release for Pillman. Bischoff agreed and fired Pillman legitimately so that he could go and develop his loose cannon gimmick in ECW and return to WCW with more legitimate heat. This would later backfire on Bischoff as Pillman did not return to WCW and instead joined Vince McMahon's WWE. However, in WWE, Pillman became even more of a loose cannon, and on October 5, 1997, Brian Pillman was found dead in his hotel room at 35 years old. And now we're moving down a tier into the 4th tier, with our first entry on the 4th tier being Ric Flair shows up on WWE TV with the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. When Ted Turner bought out Jim Crockett Promotions, he made a number of controversial decisions. The worst decision of all was firing the biggest star of the company, Ric Flair. At the time, the Nature Boy Ric Flair had multiple NWA World Heavyweight Championship reigns and was indisputably the most recognizable figure in the newly christened WCW. But Ted Turner appointee Jim Herd was, for whatever reason, unable to come to terms with Ric Flair. He fired the Nature Boy and demanded that he return the WCW title belt. However, what Jim Herd didn't realize was that the belt was, in fact, Flair's property. Flair had purchased the belt years earlier so that the NWA could use it, feeling that the original NWA title lacked flair. It was customary for the champion to pay a $10,000 deposit on the belt, and Ric Flair demanded Herd pay up before the belt would be returned. Jim Herd refused, and shortly after, the WCW title belt wound up on WWE television. Ric Flair called it the real World Championship, and even though the NWA or WCW were never directly referenced, fans knew what was up. This was an insane moment. And up next you have Goldberg's arm almost amputated. On the December 23, 1999 edition of WCW Thunder, Goldberg found a limousine belonging to the New World Order, of whom he was feuding with at the time. Goldberg was actually hiding a metal pipe that he was supposed to use against the windows. However, he got too excited and wound up hitting one of the windows with his forearm, rather than simply using the pipe, and blood was clearly visible to the viewers before the show went off the air. It turned out to be a serious injury that jeopardized Goldberg's professional wrestling career. A piece of broken glass cut an artery in his arm, and Goldberg had to seek medical attention. Goldberg was very close to having his arm amputated, but doctors were able to perform successful surgery. He wound up missing 5 months of action. And up next we have the Halloween Havoc 1998 feed cutting off. The Halloween Havoc 1998 event was the apex of bad. Not only did fans suffer through Warrior Hogan 2, but the fans at home got robbed of the much anticipated Diamond Dallas Page and Goldberg title match, because right as the match started and they locked up, the feed was cut and the pay-per-view was over. At the time, every wrestling company was allotted 3 hours for their pay-per-views, while WrestleMania usually got 4. Every wrestling fan, worker and executive knew this, but WCW, even as they were faltering, attempted to run over time. Paying customers were pissed and demanded refunds. WCW apologized and aired the match for free on Nitro the next night, but the damage was already done. And up next we have the Diamond Dallas Page and Eric Bischoff fight. In the early 90s, DDP and Eric Bischoff worked together when both men provided commentary on WCW programming. Over the years, their roles changed significantly, with Diamond Dallas Page becoming a 3-time WCW World Champion, while Eric Bischoff ran the whole company as president. However, the two got off to a rocky start, as the first time that they met, they were pretty drunk and they got involved in a pull-apart fight. The next morning, DDP went to Eric Bischoff's hotel room, where Bischoff acknowledged that he was an a-hole the previous night and apologized to DDP. DDP accepted his apology and they put the incident behind them. And up next we have the Judy Bagwell on a pole match. Towards the end of WCW, Vince Russo liked to put things on poles, even actual people. Luckily, Judy Bagwell wasn't hung from an actual pole, but she was lifted above the ring in a forklift in a match that saw Buff Bagwell against Chris Kanyon, and if Kanyon won, he also would have won the valet services of Buff Bagwell's mother, Judy Bagwell. While there have been many matches over the years where the winner will get a valet, there was just no reason she had to be suspended on a forklift. The end of this match saw Buff Bagwell save his mother from a doomed fate, but the whole thing was just bizarre. And up next we have Scott Steiner shoots on Ric Flair. It's no secret that Scott Steiner hated Ric Flair in the past, and it all stemmed from their first bout in 1992, where Ric Flair was accused of sandbagging by Steiner, and Steiner had heat with him ever since that day. Almost 10 years after his match with Flair, Steiner was still pissed, and if anything, his hatred had grew even more fierce with time. In the year 2000, Steiner, a big enough star for WCW, buried Ric Flair on live television. In the now infamous promo, Steiner lambasted Flair in a vicious tirade, labeling him a fraud who stole Buddy Rogers' gimmick, and condemning him as a jealous old bastard in the business. As a cherry on top, Steiner criticized his own company, WCW, and said that he would much rather watch WWE. And up next we have the WCW Reboot. WCW was in great shape with many viewers at the start of '99, but too many negatives led to the downfall. And because of things going bad for WCW, Vince Russo and Eric Bischoff decided to reboot the company, stripping every champion of their titles and crowning new ones. The hope was that the company would feel fresh and exciting again to at least put up a fight during the Monday Night Wars. The reboot didn't work though, because for fans who had been watching WCW avidly for years, seeing all the progress just stripped away felt like a massive slap in the face. WCW was a mess at this time, and seeing something like this made fans stop watching the product. And up next we have Kevin Nash attacks fan. In 1997, NWO members Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, and Sean Weltman appeared on the MTV show Fame or Shame as part of MTV's Spring Break. The NWO members were there to punish members of the talent show, with other fans watching along as the punishment occurred. However, one fan in the crowd was being a problem and started throwing rocks at the NWO, with one allegedly striking Kevin Nash in the head. Kevin Nash then leapt into the crowd and chased down the man who was throwing rocks at lightning quick speed, tackled him and then choked him whilst informing the poor soul that they'd be pressing charges. The opposite actually happened, as the boy's parents filed a lawsuit against Kevin Nash, but they eventually settled out of court, with Kevin Nash having to pay the person he attacked $1. Hilariously, Kevin Nash didn't take this too seriously as he wrote an apology letter to the man in question in red crayon, indicating how much he saw the whole situation as a trivial matter. And up next we have Raven's release. Raven and Eric Bischoff didn't have the best relationship in WCW due to how their business deal went. Bischoff signed Raven away from ECW when many of the stars from Paul Heyman's promotion wanted a bigger contract and more promotions. Raven's hope to become a big star in WCW didn't go as he envisioned though. Bischoff didn't do Raven any favors with his booking of a character that once created magic in ECW, and on a radio show, Raven made disparaging comments about Bischoff in WCW. After this radio interview, Eric Bischoff was talking down to the locker room about certain names having a bad attitude, and this led to him offering a wild scenario. Bischoff offered a release to anyone if they felt they would be happier elsewhere, and much to Eric Bischoff's surprise, Raven stood up and took Eric Bischoff on his offer. Bischoff agreed to fire Raven under the stipulation that he couldn't sign with WWE for the rest of his deal. And up next we have Undertaker in WCW. After a career with the WWE which spanned 3 decades, The Undertaker feels synonymous with Vince McMahon's professional wrestling empire. However, he wasn't always under the WWE banner, with him in fact initially wrestling in WCW, competing as Mean Mark Callis. However, less than a year into WCW, he left during negotiations for a new contract with WCW. What prompted him to leave was when the booker of WCW, Arn Anderson, told him that no one would pay to see him, so he wasn't going to increase his contract. And so Mean Mark Callis didn't re-sign with WCW and instead joined WWE and has become one of the greatest superstars to ever step into the ring. And now we're moving down the iceberg into the 3rd tier, with our first entry on the 3rd tier being the racism lawsuit. In 2001, Sonny Ono, Rick Reeves, and a bunch of other non-white performers in WCW filed a lawsuit against WCW, alleging racial discrimination and offensive remarks made by higher-ups, revealing a bias against African American wrestlers and other non-white wrestlers. WCW's training facility, the WCW Power Plant, was accused of discriminatory practices. The lawsuit claims that Bischoff used the N-word on several occasions when referencing black wrestlers. According to the lawsuit, Bischoff also stated that the reason why WCW didn't have many black wrestlers was because wrestling was a quote-unquote white man's sport. Vince Russo was also accused of being racist. According to the lawsuit, Russo displayed much of the same prejudice as Bischoff did during his tenure with the company. He also allegedly used the N-word on multiple occasions. He would also make outrageous statements including quote-unquote whites rule wrestling and quote-unquote black folks don't buy wrestling tickets, wrestling fans are white. This lawsuit was settled out of court, with WCW paying several millions of dollars to various wrestlers for racial discrimination over the years. And up next we have the Viagra on a pole match. Tori Wilson was the manager of Billy Kidman, as well as being romantically involved with him. She eventually left him for Shane Douglas, starting a dreadful rivalry between Kidman and Shane Douglas. This led to some horrible moments, which included videos of Kidman and Wilson and Douglas in bed together shown on live TV. Of course, it didn't really show anything, but the videos did show that Douglas couldn't get his member up, if you catch the drift. This led to Billy Kidman versus Shane Douglas in a Viagra on a pole match, which ended in Tori Wilson rubbing the pills into the face of Kidman. And up next we have the Ric Flair heart attack angle. It was no secret that Ric Flair and Eric Bischoff did not like each other. The pair butted heads both on and off screen in WCW, with Bischoff not knowing how to book Flair, forcing him into a strange amount of retirement matches and forcing him to lose them. The pair was set to wrestle at Starrcade 1998, but disaster struck just 2 weeks before the event. After cutting an impassioned promo about Bischoff, Flair fell to the ground and clutched his left arm. Medics ran to the ring and helped Flair to the back, leading fans to believe that the Nature Boy had suffered a heart attack live on TV. Not only did the fans not know this was fake, neither did the boys in the back. WCW only told a select few about the angle, leading to Flair's friends and family going into panic at what they had seen. This was a disgusting promotional tactic because Ric Flair did not suffer a heart attack, and it was all a work. And up next we have the Rey Mysterio and Jennifer Aniston dating rumors. When Rey Mysterio was in WCW, there was a rumor that he had dated Jennifer Aniston. It all stems from a 1997 article in the National Enquirer that claims Mysterio and Aniston, who were starring on the NBC hit Friends at the time, exchanged numbers. The story alleged that Mysterio even showed the actress's face upon their first meeting. There was no substance behind these rumors though, and Rey Mysterio found it hilarious, and so did the boys backstage in WCW, who constantly ribbed Mysterio about the story. There's been rumors that WCW knew this wasn't true, but they put this rumor out there to the tabloids in order to increase the popularity for Rey Mysterio. And up next we have the Kiss Demon. The 23 August 1999 episode of Monday Nitro had a very special main event, a live performance by the legendary rock band Kiss. However, it turned out that wrestling fans watch wrestling to see wrestling, and when presented with a concert on Nitro, hundreds of thousands of viewers decided to change the channel and see what Steve Austin and The Rock were doing. In the end, Nitro drew one of its lowest quarter-hour ratings up to that point, and it didn't come cheap. The Kiss WCW relationship wasn't over though, and at the end of their Nitro performance, the band unveiled a fearsome new wrestler decked out in the Gene Simmons face paint, the Demon. This would be a Kiss-sponsored wrestler, and of course the band would be getting their cut. There was a clause in Kiss's contract with WCW that the Demon had to appear in the main event on a pay-per-view, so WCW forced the Demon to wrestle the War at Super Brawl 2000 in what was billed as a special main event match, but was only the fourth bout on the card. And up next we have Tank Abbott pulls out a knife. Tank Abbott was a legend of 1990s mixed martial arts back when the Ultimate Fighting Championship, UFC, was in its infancy. But in 1999, Tank Abbott moved on to another venture for a brief period, the world of professional wrestling. From 1999 to 2000, Tank Abbott competed in WCW for a run that was less high profile than Ken Shamrock's WWE run, but had its moments. Tank Abbott got into a feud with one of his own entourage, a man only known as Big Al, who disliked that Abbott ditched the UFC for wrestling. Their pay-per-view match was a leather jacket on a pole match, with Abbott's UFC jacket on the line. After winning the bout, Tank Abbott did something unexpected. He pulled out a knife, put it to Big Al's throat, and threatened to kill him. Cameras cut away, and Tony Schiavone tried to cover it by saying it was scissors to cut Big Al's beard, even though Big Al had no beard. This was not part of the script, and WCW fired him immediately. And up next we have Mike Awesome vs Taz. For all the talk of war between AEW and WWE, they have nothing on the Monday Night Wars of the mid-90s between WWE and WCW. Sprinkle some ECW in there too for good measure. For nearly 5 years, the three companies waged war with each other. On one fateful night, all three promotions had their legal teams find a way to converge on the Forbidden Door when a contracted WCW wrestler defended the ECW title against a contracted WWE wrestler inside an ECW arena. In late 1999, Taz had left ECW and signed a contract for WWE, and Mike Awesome left ECW and signed for WCW while being the ECW World Champion. Paul Heyman arranged that Taz face off against Mike Awesome for the ECW World Championship, and Taz won the match. This is the real Forbidden Door. And up next we have Eric Bischoff throws coffee on Eddie Guerrero. Along with Hollywood Hulk Hogan, Bischoff believed that only established stars were going to be able to put WWE out of business. He wanted people who could put asses in seats, and in his eyes, Eddie Guerrero wasn't that. When Eric was confronted backstage by Eddie Guerrero about the Latino Heat's role within the company, Bischoff grew so frustrated that he threw a cup of coffee on Eddie Guerrero. Fortunately for Bischoff, Eddie's cooler head prevailed and he reported the incident to HR rather than throttling Eric Bischoff on the spot, as we all know he could have done. Eric was forced to apologize, and the incident was even referenced on Monday Nitro and led to the formation of the Latino World Order. And up next we have Vader and Paul Orndorff backstage fight. In the mid-90s before the NWO, the biggest babyface in WCW was Hulk Hogan, and it was only natural that he feud with the biggest heel under contract with WCW, Big Van Vader. In fact, bookers had scripted Hogan to lose the WCW World title to Vader on the second episode of Monday Nitro. However, a simple miscommunication resulted in wrestling history changing forever. At the time, Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff was still an active wrestler but spent most of his time as an agent for WCW. When he couldn't find Vader for a photo shoot, Mr. Wonderful assumed that Vader was shirking his responsibilities and made some negative comments about him. Vader was actually late because he was at a different photo shoot that ran long, but when he hit the building, gossip about Orndorff's comments reached his ears. Vader strode up to Mr. Wonderful and pushed him, calling him several vulgar names. Mr. Wonderful responded by punching him with his badly atrophied arm and knocking Vader to the concrete. Paul Orndorff then proceeded to stomp Vader's head in until the big man was bloody. Since Vader had been the instigator, Eric Bischoff fired him on the spot. Vader wound up in WWE, and Hogan held onto the title for longer than originally planned. Mr. Wonderful would later say that he could have handled the situation better, and Vader would say that he was afraid to beat up an old man. And up next we have Vince McMahon send Kevin Nash and Scott Hall to destroy WCW conspiracy. Kevin Nash and Scott Hall had performed for Vince's WWF in the 90s as Diesel and Razor Ramon, but they jumped ship to WCW at a time when Eric Bischoff was given more control of the company. Nash and Hall debuted for WCW as the Outsiders, with the insinuation that they had been sent by Vince and the WWF to kill WCW. This was furthered when Hulk Hogan joined the team at Bash at the Beach 1996 to form the New World Order, along with former 1-2-3 Kid Sean Waltman and the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase, all former WWF stars. Several conspiracy theorists have claimed that this was actually going on behind the scenes, believing Hall and Nash didn't go to WCW just for the money, but instead to destroy Vince's rival promotion from the inside, allowing WWF to rule supreme once again. Even though the NWO put more eyes on the WCW product, they played a massive role in WCW's downfall, and allegedly this was all Vince's idea. And up next we have Mick Foley loses ear. Mick Foley has suffered countless injuries throughout his professional wrestling career, but perhaps the most grisly injury of Mick's career occurred in WCW, on a European tour in 1994 during a show in Munich, Germany. His name in WCW was Cactus Jack, and he had a match against Big Van Vader, and things took a turn for the worse in this match. During this match, Mick Foley performed the hangman maneuver, in which a wrestler's neck gets caught between the middle and the top ropes, leaving them dangling and hanging. Neither wrestler was aware that the ring ropes, which were elevator cables wrapped in rubber casing, were drawn in extra tight, so Mick Foley's neck got legitimately caught and he could barely move. Cactus eventually freed himself, but his ear was split and bleeding. When he re-entered the ring, he began trading blows with Vader, who soon reached up and grabbed Mick Foley's right ear and ripped it off. The wrestlers continued the match as the referee picked up their ear and handed it over to the ring announcer. Mick Foley then underwent a 4-hour reconstructive surgery to fix his ear, and thankfully he came out of this alright, just missing most of his ear. And now we're moving down the iceberg into Tier 2, with our first entry on Tier 2 being the Arn Anderson and Sid Vicious scissors fight. One of the things that seems to repeat itself in the pro wrestling industry is a veteran feeling that a new up-and-coming star doesn't have the proper respect for the business. That was certainly the case with Arn Anderson and Sid Vicious. Arn Anderson had been trying to teach the relatively green Vicious the rules of the business, but Sid's stardom had gone to his head. Tensions boiled over during a road trip at a posh hotel. Sid Vicious confronted Arn Anderson in his room, and from that point things got murky. Both men accused the other of being the one to start the fight, but one thing is clear. Sid at one point grabbed a pair of scissors and stabbed Arn Anderson 5 times. Then Arn got the scissors away from Sid and stabbed him anywhere from 12 to 20 times. Anderson ended up with a punctured lung and both men needed stitches. And just like that, WCW had another scandal on their hands. Since Arn was the longest tenured man in the company, Sid Vicious was fired and ended up in WWE as Sid Justice and Psycho Sid. For years, WCW refused to consider hiring Vicious out of respect for Arn. However, late in the promotion's life, the two buried the hatchet and Arn agreed to allow Sid back into the company. And up next we have Missy Hyatt sues for SA. In the late 80s and early 90s, Missy Hyatt was one of the biggest female names in wrestling. Hyatt became known for her broadcast work and managing a range of talents. After she left WCW in 1994, she filed a lawsuit against WCW claiming SA and that the company had underpaid her relative to her male counterparts, filling similar functions on the air. In her lawsuit, she said that the booker Ollie Anderson used to proposition her to perform oral on him constantly and used to frequently make snide and crude remarks toward her. The lawsuit was ultimately settled out of court in December of 1996, with Missy Hyatt receiving a big payout. And up next we have Rey Mysterio unmasked. Rey Mysterio's mask is one of the most iconic images in professional wrestling. However, when Rey Mysterio was in WCW, they forced him to unmask. At Super Bowl 1999, Rey Mysterio and Conan faced off against the Outsiders, and the match had a stipulation that if Rey Mysterio's team won, then Mr. Elizabeth, who was the then valet for the Outsiders, would have to be shaved bald, and if the Outsiders won, then Rey Mysterio would have to be unmasked. Rey Mysterio sadly lost this match and had to unmask on live TV. Being unmasked as a luchador is the biggest dishonor they can face. There was no reason for Rey Mysterio to put his mask on the line in such a nothing match, but the powers that be demanded it, which was Scott Hall who politicked hard for this match to happen. Later on in an interview, Rey Mysterio said that he was at risk of being fired from his job if he didn't agree to lose his mask, and with WWE not interested in his services at the time, he had no choice but to be unmasked in WCW. And up next we have WCW technically only closed in 2017. Among wrestling fans, there's a common misconception that WWE bought WCW in 2001, but this was not actually the case, as WWE only bought certain assets, including the trademark, licensing, and video library, but they did not buy the company itself. Before WCW was called WCW, it was called the Universal Wrestling Corporation under Jim Crockett Promotions, but when Vince bought the rights to WCW in 2001, Time Warner just reverted back to the legal name of Universal Wrestling Corporation to handle the guarantee contracts and lawsuits that were pending against Time Warner. Up until 2017, WCW under the name of Universal Wrestling Corporation was still registered as an active Georgia domiciled subsidiary of Time Warner. So this means technically WCW lasted until 2017. And up next we have Haku fights off 8 police officers. Haku is a legend in wrestling and competed in the likes of WWE and WCW over the course of his career. He is someone who has had a long reputation for being one of the most legitimately tough, hard, and fearless individuals of all time, with multiple stories coming out with him over the years to back this up. One of these stories involved the legendary tag team, the Steiner Brothers. This incident happened at a bar when the Steiner brothers got into a fight and Haku tried to break it up, and when the cops came, they thought that Haku was the one who was actually fighting, and so they put him into handcuffs. Due to being wrongfully detained, Haku managed to fight a sea of police officers, with the reported number of officers being 8. In the commotion, Haku was then sprayed with mace, but instead of a normal reaction, where someone may go down clutching their eyes, Haku just closed his eyes and breathed it all in a scene which must have looked like something like an anime character taking in something to make him even stronger. According to the Steiner brothers, Haku proceeded to snap the handcuffs and continued to fight with the 8 police officers. Haku had reportedly taken several baton shots from the officers and was completely unfazed by whatever came his way. And up next we have the original NWO logo. The NWO has an iconic logo. The NWO t-shirt with their logo is one of the highest selling wrestling t-shirts of all time. But this wasn't always their logo, as when they first formed in mid-1996, their first logo was very different, as it was circular and had an NW in the middle. It looks quite strange looking back on it, but it's a good thing that they changed the logo, because this one doesn't look as good. And up next we have DX invades WCW. WWE vs WCW was more than just one conventional competition. The rivalry was a no-holds-barred deathmatch between 2 juggernauts of professional wrestling, and the individuals at the very top, Vince McMahon and Ted Turner, legitimately detested one another. WCW took a lot of shots at WWE, and because of this, WWE sent D-Generation X to invade WCW. Triple H and his teammates, dressed in military attire, rode towards WCW on a tank and demanded that Bischoff release Kevin Nash and Scott Hall. WCW management quickly closed the doors and backed away from a confrontation that they had been craving for months. This was a cool moment and was clearly the inspiration of the Elite invading Monday Night Raw. And up next we have Ric Flair in a mental hospital. Flair didn't always get the best storylines in WCW. While Ric Flair was serving as on-screen WCW president in 1999, he took part in a ridiculous storyline that saw him getting locked up in a Florida mental institution. As part of the angle, we got Flair walking around the institution in boxers and his dress robe, while bad mockeries of disabled people roamed the halls behind him. This was just distasteful and clearly a step below for the Nature Boy. And up next we have Vince McMahon sent Vince Russo to destroy WCW conspiracy. In the mid to late 90s, Vince Russo was the WWE head writer and was a huge part of the creative direction during the Attitude Era. In interviews, Russo has said that he left WWE in the summer of '99 because he felt that the addition of a second show, SmackDown, would water down his creative juices. Russo then replaced Eric Bischoff and jumped ship to WCW, which was on a downturn seeing that the ratings had declined and there were low pay-per-view and attendance rates in comparison to their prior years. Under Russo's creative control, WCW managed to get even worse as he booked some very questionable things. Vince Russo essentially ran WCW into the ground, and some conspiracy theorists believe that it was all by the design from the mind of Vince McMahon. This theory believes that McMahon sent Russo as a Trojan horse to WCW on purpose so that they can put the final nail in WCW's coffin. And up next we have the Ultimate Warrior's trapdoor injures the British Bulldog's back. The Ultimate Warrior wrestled his final match at Fall Brawl 1998, participating in a War Games match against a team also involving Hulk Hogan. His performance in that match, while terrible, has little relevance. However, it was an undercard match involving the British Bulldog that showed just how bad of an environment working in WCW was at the time. Warrior entered into his match through a trapdoor in the ring, something nobody had warned the other wrestlers about. Not knowing how to avoid the trapdoor, the British Bulldog took a back bump onto the Ultimate Warrior's trapdoor, which was said to be like concrete. This caused a horrendous injury for the Bulldog that ended up getting infected, causing him to spend 6 months in the hospital and starting him on the road to a pill addiction that would contribute to his death 4 years later. And now we're moving on to the deepest and darkest part of the iceberg, Tier 1, with our first entry on Tier 1 being the Columbine shooting affecting WCW. Alex Wright was signed by WCW in 1994 at the age of 18. He was a young pretty boy with good looks and a wealth of in-ring skills. Alex Wright would also receive strong ratings for his segments on television, which helped further his push in the company. However, by 1999, Eric Bischoff wanted to take Wright's career to another level, and so he was pulled off of TV while Bischoff and company developed Wright's new persona. After months of being out of WCW spotlights, vignettes began airing touting his return, and in these vignettes, Alex Wright was given a darker image, complete with mohawk-dyed hair, a long trench coat, and a cane. His name was changed to Berlin, and he was a completely different character. However, Berlin's debut would have to be pushed back for a while after the infamous Columbine High School shooting, which saw the teenage shooters wear long black trench coats. Time Warner feared the comparison and held off on Berlin until things calmed down a bit. But even when things calmed down a bit, WCW still did not want anyone to draw parallels between the character and the tragic events in Colorado, and so he was given a less than decent push. The combination of the Columbine shooting and his Berlin gimmick managed to negatively impact his career, and he never recovered since. Wright was not picked up by WWE during the WCW buyout because he was under contract to Time Warner and not WCW, and therefore he was unable to make the jump. And up next we have Lex Luger and Miss Elizabeth. Miss Elizabeth's most famous relationship was with the Macho Man Randy Savage, but not many people know that towards the end of her life she was actually dating Lex Luger. In WCW, Miss Elizabeth was also a part of the NWO, but from 1999 to 2000, she managed Lex Luger in WCW. The pair eventually left WCW though, and it was clear that they were both not meant for each other, as the basis of their relationship was pills, alcohol, and lots of fighting. Luger was even arrested for beating up Elizabeth while they were both messed up on pills and alcohol, giving her 2 black eyes, a bump on the head, and a busted lip. Luger was released on bail, but less than 2 weeks after this incident, Miss Elizabeth overdosed while she was with Lex Luger and died. Fans found this suspicious, and they came up with a conspiracy theory that something more sinister was at play, and Luger was actually the one behind Elizabeth's death. And up next we have the Giant punches a fan in a bar. The Big Show, who was known by the Giant in WCW, stands at 7 feet tall and weighs upwards of 400 pounds, and considering all of this, who in their right mind would try and fight him? One fan apparently thought he was up to the challenge. During his tenure in WCW, the Big Show tried to check into a hotel. However, some of the hotel bar patrons started heckling him for being a fake wrestler. Then a fan took things too far and started to get physical with Mr. Big Show, which was a big mistake. The Giant punched the man out and broke his jaw. Though Wright was arrested and had to go to court, video of the incident exonerated him and kept him out of further legal trouble. Even though the Big Show used his punch as a finisher only towards the latter part of his career, we certainly know that it was already in his arsenal. And up next we have hiring Art Barr despite his past. Art Barr was an American professional wrestler who found his greatest success in Mexico's AAA promotion, and he was not the man who invented the frog splash, but he was the one who brought the popularity of the frog splash to a wider audience in USA. In 1989, Art Barr raped a 19-year-old girl after a wrestling event. Under polygraph, Bar admitted that the girl did not consent to fornicate with him, but insisted that he believed that she would have had they been in a different location. Art Bar worked a plea bargain and was convicted of first-degree SA and fined a mere $1,000 and sentenced to a paltry 180 hours of community service. After this whole ordeal, Art Bar had a hard time finding work until WCW hired him, but WCW tried to hide his true identity under the makeup and powder wig of the Juicer character, which was a blatant Beetlejuice ripoff. This was in the days before the internet, so Art Bar's identity and crime were relatively unknown to a majority of fans, so WCW avoided controversy until years after Bar no longer worked for the company. In 1994, he died of a drug-induced heart attack. He was fondly remembered by his best friend Eddie Guerrero though, as when he died in 1994, Eddie Guerrero adopted the frog splash as a tribute to his departed friend. And up next we have Vince McMahon had a mole in WCW that led to the buyout in 2001. In June of 2000, WWF announced on its corporate page that they had hired Stuart Snyder as the president and COO of WWF. Snyder was a former Time Warner executive and even worked alongside Brad Siegel, who was one of the executives that was in charge of WCW. Stuart Snyder and Brad Siegel became colleagues during their time together at Time Warner, which is the company that owned WCW. In 2001, WCW were declining in real time. Despite that, Eric Bischoff was willing to buy the entire company. Bischoff and a group of investors known as Fusion Media Ventures signed a letter of intent to buy the company for close to $50 million. Even though WCW could have accepted this offer for $50 million, they didn't. It turns out that Brad Siegel, the Time Warner executive that was in charge of WCW, was having meetings with Vince McMahon and the WWE president and COO, Stuart Snyder. It seems that Vince McMahon and Stuart Snyder convinced Brad Siegel to pull all WCW programming off of Warner Networks in order for WWE to get them at a cheaper price. Eric Bischoff and Fusion only bid close to $50 million because they were under the assumption that WCW were to remain on the network. But Brad Siegel pulled strings to make sure that WCW was taken off all Warner networks. This basically meant that Brad Siegel was working as Vince McMahon's mole in WCW, facilitating the sale to WWE and blocking all other potential buyers, as Randy Savage and Jeff Jarrett were also blocked from buying WCW. This resulted in WCW, a company worth $600 million in 2001, being sold to Vince McMahon for $4.5 million. Vince McMahon managed to pull off the heist of the century. And up next we have Gold Club Eric Bischoff. While Eric Bischoff was working in WCW as the president, he frequented a posh strip club called the Gold Club. And surprise, surprise, Gold Club was a very shady club, as they were involved in a lot of crime. So much so that the landmark establishment had been indicted on federal racketeering charges that include fornication selling, credit card fraud, money laundering, police corruption, and ties to New York's Gambino organized crime family. The owner of this club was Steve Kaplan, and he paid his dancers to provide fornication favors to professional athletes and celebrities in an attempt to attract more affluent clientele, and Eric Bischoff was one of these celebrities. So in the case against Steve Kaplan, former WCW figurehead Eric Bischoff had to testify, and he said that he went to the club a few times, but one time him and his wife left with a stripper and they paid $200 for her services. Eric Bischoff wasn't in any real trouble, but the owner of the Gold Club, Steve Kaplan, was, and he was sentenced to 16 months in prison, 400 hours of community service, and a $5 million fine. And up next we have Hardbody Harrison. Hardbody Harrison was a wrestler who trained at the WCW power plant and debuted with WCW in 1995. Known chiefly for his physique and strange ring attire, Hardbody Harrison never moved above jobber status. Harrison's contract was not picked up after Vince McMahon and the WWF purchased WCW. He then subsequently retired from professional wrestling. However, somewhere along the way, things went wrong for the former WCW wrestler. In 2007, local and federal authorities discovered that Hardbody Harrison had been living with several females in a Georgia home as part of a fornication selling ring, and the 8 women there were being held against their will and were used as slaves. Hardbody's victims claimed that they were forced to complete a multitude of tasks and chores in addition to being pimped out to clubs, trailer parks, and parties, and were forced to have sex with up to 8 men at a time. In this case, Hardbody decided to act as his own lawyer, and he contended that the women were willingly living in his home because they wanted to train as professional wrestlers. He said many of them arrived on drugs and he was just trying to help them better their lives. Harrison was unable to convince anyone of his story and was instead sentenced to life imprisonment. And up next we have the Mean Gene Scam Hotline. Back in the mid-90s, wrestling hotlines were in fashion as the internet wasn't back then what it is now. Fans could call the paid phone number and get all the gossip from the wrestling world, as well as participate in wrestling quizzes and even listen to wrestlers' interviews. WWE, WCW and ECW all had a paid hotline number which would charge by the minute. Mean Gene had the WCW Saturday Night TV platform to redirect fans toward the WCW hotline. He would use very underhanded tactics in the book to increase traffic on the hotline, often baiting the potential callers with misleading information and even blatant lies. These cheap antics were a regular part of his act, where he would say something that never manifested, but he finally crossed the line on February 5th, 1995. He asked fans to call and find out which former 45-year-old heavyweight champion had died. He implied that the death was former world champion Ric Flair. The gullible wrestling fans actually took the bait and started calling, and it was WCW Hotline's biggest payday in history, with up to 12,000 people calling in instead of the usual 800. They ended up clocking in around $75,000 in revenue, instead of the $5,000 they usually made. The champion who actually passed away was Jerry Blackwell from AWA, and the callers waited almost 5 minutes to get this misleading revelation. It turns out that Gene Okerlund did this because he was making 75% of the total revenue generated from these calls. A lot of people called him out for this, and he simply gave a half-hearted apology for it the next week. And up next we have the NWO is Illuminati conspiracy. In the mid-90s, the group of Shawn Michaels, Triple H, Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, and Sean Waltman would form the Clique, and their goal was simple: be at the top of the wrestling industry at all costs necessary. They largely achieved this as Triple H and Shawn Michaels found major success in WWE, and Scott Hall and Kevin Nash were basically running WCW, getting loads of money along with the New World Order. This conspiracy believes that the Clique sold their souls to the devil in order to achieve ultimate success in the wrestling world. The basis of this theory is that the two sweet hand sign resembles devil horns, and the naming of their factions, New World Order and D-Generation X, were Illuminati related. In the Illuminati sense, the New World Order is a conspiracy theory that argues that a shadowy elite is trying to implement a totalitarian world government, where everybody is controlled by these elite figures. The New World Order is trying to usher in a culture of degeneration, and that's where D-Generation X comes in. D-Generation X was there to inspire the youth to degenerate, so that they can be easily controlled by the New World Order. And up next we have the Renegade. With Hulk Hogan's arrival in WCW from WWE, there came a desire for WCW to replicate some of Hogan's classic storylines, including his relationship with the Ultimate Warrior. However, rather than deal with Warrior, WCW opted to hire a wrestler to portray a homegrown warrior-like character called the Renegade. And so the Renegade debuted as a warrior copycat, with similar face paint, bodybuilder physique, long hair, and tassels. He had a somewhat decent run in WCW as he captured the television championship, but he eventually got demoted to jobber status and he was released from WCW in early December of 1998. Out of a job and unable to secure any new wrestling work, the Renegade fell into a depression, working as a bouncer. What's worse is that he got involved with variations of the drug GHB, which was originally promoted as a bodybuilding supplement, but was found out to be a severe depressant. In late February 1999, 3 months after his WCW departure, Wilson took his own life and died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound at 33 years old. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed this video, please check out our other videos, and also please like, share, comment, and subscribe. But anyway, goodbye.